Stop sleeping on Resident Evil Mercenaries. Despite what IGN may claim, it is not just some bonus mode. Mercenaries is a game unto itself and one that is just as highly developed of an action game as Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden. This is Capcom we're talking about, the gods of the arcade, especially with beat-em-up style combat. And Mercs, even compared to the best arcade games out there, deserves recognition as an elite single-player competitive experience with refined scoring and deep combat mechanics. Resident Evil campaign modes are great, and I know they are the core selling point for most casual players, but Mercs adds so much more depth and replayability that it's criminal how overlooked it has been by critics. And so if you are a fan of Resident Evil or of action games generally, you owe it to yourself to experience Resident Evil Mercs to the full extent of what the series has to offer, and this video is here to help you. Today I am joined by fellow Resident Evil Mercs enthusiast Kriegor as a special advisor for this episode, and we go through and rank a tier list analyzing all the games across the series. One important note is that in this ranking, we are judging the quality of the Mercs modes against one another, but as a whole, it's important to remember that the core formula of Mercs is significantly more engaging than most action games being made these days. So even a below average Mercs mode is still far more fun than an above average campaign mode. It's the game design equivalent of pizza, where it's almost always pretty good, even when it's bad, unless something truly disastrous has happened. And for the most part, Mercenaries has been treated very lovingly by Capcom's capable hands. And so thank you very much for joining us. Let's begin. To kick things off, we have the prototype for what would become Mercenaries mode later on, which is Resident Evil 2 4th Survivor mode. This is a 20-minute condensed, linear, combat-focused experience, and even though it doesn't have a scoring system yet, it does have performance analysis via the in-game timer. So even though you don't have the whole picture of what Mercenaries would become, the scoring is a major factor, you have the basic structure for the Mercenaries mode. That is very fun and engaging. The major issue with it, though, very much like many other survival horror games, is because it doesn't have a scoring system and instead uses the timer to measure performance, then that disincentivizes combat. Why waste time fighting something when you can simply run around it? And so even though 4th Survivor mode is really cool and builds the foundation for what Mercenaries can become, it doesn't have all of the ingredients, but you definitely have to give it credit for establishing the baseline.
That's when Capcom start to experience with alternate modes with Resident Evil, and when they start to want to offer to the players that finished the main campaign something to do, a greater challenge, something to test their skills quite in the main game, but in an arcade setting.
This one is very hard to rank because it isn't technically a Mercenaries mode, so we're going to leave 4th Survivor unranked, but definitely worth a mention because of its historical significance. And so then that brings us to Resident Evil 3, which is the beginning of Mercenaries mode. A lot of you may think that it begins with 4, but no. Mercenaries begins with Resident Evil 3, and it's surprisingly well developed. And so Resident Evil 3 is the only official Mercenaries mode that uses fixed camera angles and that classic Resident Evil style combat system. And so if you're looking for that style of combat system in an arcade-like experience, you're only going to really get that in Resident Evil 3 Mercenaries. And building off of 4th Survivor, we now have score. Thank God. Score is an incredibly important feature of Mercenaries, as we'll point out as we go through this ranking. It also has discrete time bonus items that you pick up in usual weapon locations, and then you also get time bonuses for kills, and there is a small chaining system. I say a small chaining system because unlike the later entries of the Mercenaries modes, the chaining in Resident Evil 3 is more of a little bonus because the strict timer is so short that you can't do the full chaining style that would become the meta of later Mercenaries games.
So you did indeed have as well combos, like in 4, 5, and the following Mercenaries mode. So killing enemies in combo would award more points and more times. However, combos are not a big thing in Resident Evil 3 because you only had 3 seconds between each kill to keep the combo. So you can't chain them from screen to screen, especially since in this one the enemies are really hard to kill especially compared to 4.
So you do get cool little Don Pachi style mini chains, but you don't do the full run chains. So chaining is in Resident Evil 3 Mercenaries, but it isn't quite fully developed yet. But what is very interesting is that in Mercs 3, you do have 3 distinct characters with 3 distinct playstyles, and the one that stands out as the most interesting is Nikolai because of his knife weapon.
Killing an enemy with a knife will give you 8 times more time bonuses.
Wow, so that was already there too.
That was already there. A lot of things.
That's crazy how much is already in 3.
Absolutely, yeah.
It turns out that if you kill enemies with the knife, you get an 8 times bonus, very much like the bonus melee kills that we'll see later on in the Mercenaries modes. Another cool thing that 3 does is that it even has scoring penalties for using health items and rocket launchers to prevent those from being spammed. So even this early on, it had a lot of ideas for establishing a cool playstyle. And so surprisingly, as early as Resident Evil 3 Mercenaries mode is, it already has a lot of the core structure and ingredients for what would come to define the Mercenaries mode in the later entries. And it's all in the fixed camera angle perspective, which is really cool. And so this mode, you gotta respect it. It's the OG. It surprisingly holds up over time, but it does have one massive glaring flaw, which is that it has random HP for the enemies. As we go through talking about the Mercenaries mode and the role of RNG in Mercenaries, or just arcade game design generally, there's a rule that I want to establish now and discuss, which is that the role of RNG is that you want position and behavior-based RNG, so have enemies spawn randomly, have enemies behave somewhat randomly, but you do not want to have statistical RNG, which is just pure roulette stats, where if you shoot something in the head in Resident Evil 4 Remake in the professional mode or whatever, there's an RNG roll about whether or not that will stun. Or in the case of Mercs 3 here, you have random enemy HP. The reason why statistical RNG is no bueno is because you can't fully react and route around this style of RNG consistently. Kriegor does point out that you can do some meta strats in Mercs 3 to sort of deal with this.
Usually you would just shot 2 times and then you would engage with the knife. Maybe he was weakened enough for you to kill him with the knife. Maybe he wasn't, and in this case you will have to know when you have to backtrack or step away or counter, because you can counter in 3.
Was there any way to tell from animations or anything like that? So you do the 2 shots, you go in to do the knife. Is there any clues?
Usually you knife them in the legs, or hoping for them to fall on the floor. And they start to get too close, so it was mostly judging the distance. Then you have to quickly react.
But there's going to be edge cases in times where just pure numbers cannot be beaten. You roll the dice and it just won't work out in the consistent routing style that we want to see. So this is just with general arcade game design. Something I really push for is you do not want to have statistical RNG. You want to have behavioral position-based RNG. But in terms of its ranking, both Kriegor and I agree on the grade of B. It gets a B because of how solid and well-made it is, especially for the first iteration of the mode. It's just a little underdeveloped. It doesn't have a lot of content. It doesn't have as much depth as we'll see later on, but it's a very solid beginning point, and it is cool that it is still a version with fixed camera angles, so that still makes it really stand out. So a surprisingly really solid beginning for the Mercenaries mode, beginning with Resident Evil 3.
I think the gameplay is really good. The scoring system works well. It has a lot of depth. It lacks content. There's only one map, basically, even if it's pretty big. And it lacks some mechanics I'm fond of that will come with 4.
Yes, yes.
And so that brings us to the Mercenaries mode. We all know and love the Mercenaries mode that probably introduced us all to the style in the first place, the real Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries. Let's begin with going over the strengths of this mode. First of all, the baseline mechanics. The baseline mechanics of Resident Evil 4, of course, set the foundation for the series. I've talked about it a lot over time on the channel. That mixture of the aiming, shooting combat, combining in with the melee style beat 'em up elements, and the fact that the contextual kicks and stuns directly ties those two styles of gameplay together more effectively than most everything coming out these days. It's still just an all-time classic in terms of its baseline mechanics, and for that reason I do favor it a lot. It's incredibly fun at a casual level, and it's a great introduction into Mercenaries, and so I believe most people watching this video are going to have extremely fond memories and feelings about Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries. I know that I do. That being said, when it comes to the competitive meta of the game itself, even though Mercenaries 4 has a lot of the foundation and great ideas for the mode, it isn't fully executed well. There's a lot of balancing issues with it, and so as much as I love this mode, we do need to talk about a lot of the flaws with its balance and just overall scoring design. And so the first issue is an oversight that I'm honestly shocked Capcom haven't corrected over the course of all of the reissues of Resident Evil 4. God knows how many ports of Resident Evil 4 there have been, and the Ultimate HD and all that. I'm surprised in some of these, while they're adding all these different modes and features, they didn't go in and fix some of the glaring oversights with Mercenaries. And the biggest one is actually incredibly simple, which is that melee kills do not give you time bonuses. This seems like some nerdy complaint. Oh, well, why does this matter? Well, it means that in terms of playing the game for score, one of the most iconic and important mechanics in the game, the contextual melee attacks, is basically actively bad or useless because they take a lot of time to get the kill and there's no kill bonus for them. And so with just that simple of an oversight, it completely shifts the meta of Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries in a way that I'm not a huge fan of, and Kriegor isn't a huge fan of as well, by making the melee of it kind of irrelevant.
It rewards you for using the fastest, most efficient ways to kill, so basically using grenades and high-powered weapons. That's why at high level, you just don't use your melees at all.
Nope.
The only exceptions coming to mind are Cruiser's super attack and Hunk's head stun melee on the Bella sisters. So yeah, you can use your melee moves if you want, but just like you can kill with your firearms in the other Mercenaries mode. The penalty is the same, your score will suck.
And so since melee kills don't give time bonuses, what the meta becomes is grouping enemies together, but then mass executing them with grenades and sniper rifles and high-powered weaponry, essentially. So even though you do still have that grouping, positioning element of Resident Evil 4, unfortunately, you're not getting the full extent of it because of this oversight on the time bonus kills. And then compounding this is the way bonus combo chests work, because they also incentivize you to group bunches of enemies together and execute them all at once to get the bonus points. And if you're thinking, wait, what about chaining? Doesn't chaining present a counter incentive to just killing everything in large groups? Because when you do that, you will probably drop your chain. Theoretically, when you're playing the game, and when I was first playing it, I thought this was how it worked. But the issue is that the chain cap of Resident Evil 4 is extremely low. It is only 10 kills, which means that in order to get a full max chain going again, all you need is 10 kills. And that is massively offset by the bonus of the group combo kills with the chests. And so, unfortunately, what ends up happening is that rather than getting this great melee chaining dynamic going, which seem to present themselves when you're first playing the game as a casual, the ultimate meta just becomes all about manipulating combo chests and grouping enemies together. And so that is a huge shame in terms of the design of the scoring system of Resident Evil 4.
It's heavily centered around combo bonus chests. And here's the explanation. After any kill, you now have 10 seconds to kill another enemy and gain a combo bonus. This combo bonus raises as you keep your chain going. The highest you can normally have outside bosses and combo chests is plus 700 points. And you have this kind of bonus for each kill after the 9th kill. So the 10th kills will be plus 700, the 11th kill will be plus 700, etc. Now, combo chests give you a combo bonus of plus 1000 for every kill during a 30 seconds window. It's important to understand that this bonus is not added to your standard combo bonus. It's a mistake every noobs make in every Mercenaries mode. You don't gain 1700 at 10 and more kills. It just replaces. So you gain 300 more than you'll add by just keeping your chain. And for bosses, we can give you a few thousand bonus points, then the combo bonus from the chest doesn't apply. So basically, you don't want to use a combo bonus chest when you have bosses around. You have to deal with them after or before this 30-second window, so as to not waste this precious time. So what does that mean? First, that you can break your chain no problem. As long as you open a combo chest, you're back to plus 1000 anyway, and you don't have to get to 9 kills before that. And if you can't get 9 kills during the bonus time, then you're playing this mode so wrong.
But there are some ways to offset that, I do have to point out. One of them is don't play the really OP characters like Ada and Wesker. I mean, you can if you're playing for score, obviously, but if you want a more balanced approach, play Leon because he's less overpowered with the high caliber weaponry, and also play on the castle stage because the castle stage, not only is it great in terms of its design, but it has the highest enemy cap. In fact, it has such a high enemy cap that you can never really get to the end of it, and so that is going to give you the deepest, most versatile experience with playing Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries, I think, at least in my experience. Play Leon on castle. Then you get to bring in more of the strengths of the core combat system, at least in my opinion. And so this one was kind of a divided ranking between Kriegor and myself. I ended up ranking it a B-, and I'll explain why. Even though it has all of these issues with the scoring system choices, the base layer of the game, the base combat mechanics and enemy design and level design and overall style of game design is incredibly solid and does set the template for everything else to follow. And it is also so easily fixed because the issues with 4 Mercs are not core fundamental issues. They're literally like these small oversights with scoring decisions that I think in a weekend could be fixed by a modder. All you need to do is give melee time bonuses, put the chain cap much higher than 10, and then give end of stage time bonus points.
Because in 4 you don't get bonus point for the time remaining once you've killed every enemy on the map, so that's a big mistake. They don't reward points for how much time you still have at the end of the game, so when you have reached the enemy cap. it's better to stop killing outright and help enemies regroup around the next combo chest, so you can kill as many as you can once you will open it.
And you've got a really solid Mercenaries mode right there, but the whole foundation for the scoring system is there, and so that is why I give it a B-. Kriegor gives it a C because of all these issues with the scoring system, and I think that is totally justified, especially because Capcom have had so many opportunities to fix this, or at least give an alternate version of it over all of these years, and they haven't.
I don't want it to penalize it too much because you keep playing it even after 15. We are almost at 20 years now. Resident
This game
Evil
is
4
hanging
came
in
out.
there. Yeah.
I still like to launch it from time to time, and I still think it's pretty strong in certain aspects. But I'm going to put it in C tier in comparison to the other games we are going to talk about.
But both Kriegor and I agree if the scoring issues were fixed, it would receive an A. Capcom. Which brings us to Resident Evil 5 Mercenaries. I'm not even gonna play coy with you all right now. This is the GOAT. Resident Evil 5 Mercenaries is the greatest Mercenaries mode of all time, and beyond that, it is probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, arcade action game scoring modes ever created.
What makes Resident 5 so strong?
Well, it's funny because it only changed 3 things compared to Resident Evil 4 scoring wise. First, your combo bonus increased beyond the chain of 10. The max bonus is now at 50 combo, and 1000 points at 50, the same as the combo bonus chest. So now you have to keep your chain
going.
It's better than breaking it. Opening a combo bonus chest on throughout combo at 50 serves no purpose at all anyway. Second, you now gain +5 seconds every time you kill an enemy with a melee attack. So we've talked about that. And
Yes.
so yeah, you gain time by using melee. Better player will group them, will start to group them, so they will weaken 2 enemies or 3 enemies, and they will kill all 2 or all 3 with just 1 melee moves, and that's when they will start to really pile up the time bonuses. So the third modification with scoring system compared to 4 is that excess time now give points. So excess time was worth nothing in 4, and time is king in 5.
To begin with, Resident Evil 5's combat melee system, which is building on the excellence of Resident Evil 4's melee combat and making it ultra excellent. I'm not even sure what the adjective would be. Where, for example, the contextual melee attacks. Not only do you have the great stun, shoot them in the head, do a roundhouse or do a suplex that you get in 4, now you have different styles based off of the type of stun that you do and based off where you are standing near the enemy. So if you are standing in front of them and do the old headshot, you get the traditional roundhouse kick style attack. But if you shoot them and then go around the back, then you get the coup de grace, as I would say, the finisher, which will insta-kill them. It's crazy how many variations of the melee attack you have. And they do matter, by the way. They're not just for fluff. They do come into the meta a lot. And then, even better, when you get enemies on the ground, now you have grounded melee attacks, which is straight up beat 'em up goodness. And like a beat 'em up, the combat system of Resident Evil 5 feeds into itself, where shooting with the pistol is like doing a jab in a beat 'em up, and then doing the melee attack is like doing a grab and throw, like in a beat 'em up. So Final Fight Hager, where you jab for grabs, and then you throw for iframes to set up more jabs, and then it feeds itself in this awesome loop. This is something that not a lot of 3D beat 'em ups have been able to capture and replicate as well as Resident Evil 5 has been able to. And so with all of the new melee options, it just makes the combat a lot more dynamic, a lot more interesting and deep. And then in terms of the enemy design, they have the big hit stun from Resident Evil 4, which I'm a massive fan of. I love that delicious giant amount of hit stun. But in 5, the way to make it more challenging, and I think the best way to make it more challenging, is they make the zombies faster and more evasive. So if you want to get those headshots or those stuns on their legs and everything, you've got to be much quicker with your aiming and a lot more active and prepared, and they rush you down. It's really fun, especially in Mercenaries mode where you're getting constantly surrounded. So just the core changes to the combat system of Resident Evil 5 are just a big leap forward over 4. And then there is the active menu reloading, which I have explained in a previous video. Not to get too technical, is you can start buffering in reloads during other actions. So let's say you've got your pistol, you headshot a zombie, the zombie's in the stagger state. But while you're roundhouse kicking, if you pop open the menu, you can menu reload your guns during the roundhouse. So it creates this beautiful symmetry between the gunplay and the melee that's not in 4, and it's certainly not in the remake. And so overall, what this creates is this perfect synergy between shooting and melee. Because in order to open up the melee, you shoot. And then in order to reload your weapons, you do melee. And so you have this beautiful cycle of constant interaction, constant planning. Nothing is passive. Everything is active, and it's beautiful. And you can just tell watching replays the difference between a player who's played maybe 100 hours and a player who's played 2,000 hours. And that is the type of skill depth you want to see. You want to see just all of these micro optimizations that build and build and build over time that aren't totally perceptible when you first start playing for score, but become obvious once you kind of get the idea of what's happening. Another overlooked mechanic that is extremely important during top-level play is that when you grab items, during the pickup animation you get iframes, which seems like just a utility at first. But during the routing of top-level play, this becomes a very important technique to dodge big attacks or deal with bosses or do certain setups. So this is something that you route for and plan around, and it's a really overlooked but cool feature of the gameplay system. But that's just the core mechanics, so let's start talking about the scoring system. First off, melee time bonuses. Yes, now you get bonus time for killing enemies with melee attacks. It's really cool, especially because that translates over to the second shift in the scoring system, which is time remaining bonus, which means that the faster you complete the stage, you get bonus points for the time remaining.
1 second in regular Mercenaries is worth as much as the maximum combo bonus for standard enemies, be it with or without chess. So every second remaining at the end of the run, it's plus 1000 points. So it's really good because now there's a long-term goal, an inaccessible cap for players. 4 has very well-known high score cap. We know what is the best possible score for each map. We know it. 5 don't have it. You can always be faster. You can always make a faster run. That's why it's been so played, and it's still so played nowadays.
It seems like a simple concept, but what this creates is it creates this perfect tension between you're trying to maximize your score in game, but then you have this counter incentive of, well, if you finish faster, then you'll get that bonus time. And so it creates this beautiful ambiguity in, should you try to set things up a little bit more, or should you try to kill as fast as possible? And with a really well-made scoring system like Resident Evil 5, especially Reunion mode, it's hard to really say. And so you end up having all of these really deep, complex routing decisions that you have to make because of this tension between completing for time. So that time bonus remaining feature is very important. And complementing it is the vastly improved combo chain cap. Remember back in Resident Evil 4, the chain cap was just 10? In Mercs 5 Reunion, which is the best version, there's Original and Reunion. Original, the cap is 50, which is an improvement. But in Reunion, it's 150. And so what does that mean? That means that the ideal run of Reunion is asking you to do a lot more things like killing all of the enemies in an unbroken chain all the way up to the end as fast as possible, while also delaying the boss kills. Because here's another interesting feature of 5 scoring system, which is that if you don't kill a boss, another boss won't spawn. And it turns out that bosses are more valuable to kill at the end of your chain. And so what ends up happening in the scoring system of Resident Evil 5 is you spawn a boss and you try to move around them and chain the rest of the stage, and then at the end you do this boss rush where you finish your stage with fighting the bosses, since that is a higher value than killing them earlier in your chain. Dodonpachi players will understand this. So yeah.
Top players must be able to keep their combo and keep gaining time while having an aggressive, potentially one-shotting foe next to them at all times. That's why you'll see them in the run keep like the chainsaw guy all the way up to like 130. So they will also have to consider when they will kill him, because other bosses won't join as long as he won't dead. So they will have to kill him like for example at 130. So they will still have time to kill the 5 next bosses before 150, and make sure that their 150 kill will also be a boss.
You get a very deep, incredibly addictive scoring experience by the end of this because of how many competing incentives you have as a player. And that is what makes a very robust scoring system. And this is what I was saying why Resident Evil 5 Mercenaries has probably the greatest scoring system of all, 3D action games, because of how deep it is and how you can't just solve it. And there's not just one distinct thing. There's so many different nuances and approaches that people to this day still actively play this game for score at a much higher rate than the other Mercenaries mode. And then on top of that, you have so many modes, characters, levels, weapons to choose from that you could just buy Resident Evil 5, never even play the campaign. If you even hate the campaign, you can still get an insane value, especially these days, by just playing Mercenaries. Mercenaries is a complete game unto itself. You're essentially buying 2 games in one when you get Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. In terms of flaws of Resident Evil 5 Mercenaries, it's mostly just in the structure. And what I mean is, first of all, the leaderboards are not reliable. They're hacked to hell. They're garbage. So I'm glad they have online leaderboards, but these days they're basically garbage, except on the console versions, which I'm assuming aren't as hacked. So I guess if you really want to play serious scoring leaderboards, ironically, play on like the PS4 or Xbox One X leaderboards. Most people probably just do uploading replays, but there you go. Another issue is that they don't score split the leaderboards properly. They don't have replays for the leaderboards. So if they went in and revamped those leaderboards and secured them, it would be one of the greatest scoring games of all time in terms of just outright structure. So yeah, overall, Mercs 5 is a beast, especially the Reunion version. So the overall difference between original Mercs and Reunion Mercs is original Mercs is more accessible and all about killing for time. Time is king because your chain limit is only 50, but in Reunion, the chain limit is 150, so it's all about that chain. And if you need to spend extra time to make sure that chain is set up and going, or you need to take care of the combo chests early on, then that's what you're going to need to do. But keeping that chain is a lot more difficult, and so Reunion ultimately is the more elite, deep version of the game, but both are very fun. Kriegor and I are in full agreement that it is SS tier, as in the highest tier possible, the best in the series by quite a large margin. It is the definitive Mercenaries mode experience No doubt about it.
So for regular 5 and No Mercy 5, I'm going to put them in S tier. And for Reunion, I'm going to put it in SS tier.
Yes.
And so now you're probably expecting me to talk about Mercs 6. And if so, shame on you. Shame. Because you have forgotten, I'm just kidding, because a lot of people have forgotten, that there is actually a whole game dedicated to Resident Evil Mercenaries called Resident Evil Mercenaries 3DS. And I have to say, Resident Evil Mercenaries 3DS up front is amazing. It is a really awesome game and criminally overlooked and underrated. And whenever we talk about the most unfair game reviews of all time, we often go to stuff like God Hand from IGN, which of course was really unfair, but we need to add this right next to the God Hand review because IGN did Mercs 3DS dirty. They did it real dirty. They fundamentally did not understand this game in the slightest because, like I was saying, at this point in Mercenaries, it's such a well-developed mode, such a pure, beautiful arcade experience that it is a game unto itself, and it has a fan base unto itself. And Capcom obviously saw this and decided, hey, let's make a dedicated Mercenaries game. And I think it's a brilliant idea, and it is an amazing product. But in the review, IGN is just slamming this game for the most ridiculous reasons, and one that is just absurd. One of the most absurd things I've ever read is the reviewer is essentially saying that this game has no right to exist because the Mercenaries mode of Resident Evil 5 and 6 are just bonus content that is free. And so this is like essentially selling free content. I don't know if IGN understands how free content works, but the Mercenaries mode of 5 and 6 is not free content. People like myself buy the game specifically for it. It's just grouped content. And, Mercenaries 3DS is telling you what it is at a fair price. I think it's a really cool game, and IGN's unfair review of it is another example of their anti-arcade action bias alongside Spike Out and God Hand and a lot of these really awesome games. So anyway, I just wanted to point that review out because I think it's extremely unfair, and don't let it dissuade you from actually checking this game out. And so what Mercs 3DS is this crazy fusion of content between Resident Evil 4 Mercs and Resident Evil 5, but using the superior Resident Evil 5 combat system and scoring system with its own unique elements put in there.
What they wanted was to bring the Resident Evil 5 original Mercenaries mode into the 3DS. It's very close to that mode. They added some stuff from 4. They
Village.
They new character, map and enemies, and some characters as well. There are Hauser, Hank. You also have an exclusive character, Claire, which is pretty funny because she has an interesting system. Her melee moves are string combos that you can cancel whenever you want. So if you can kill with just the first hit, you can stop there or go for the full combo if you need that much damage. A very cool character.
And so in terms of the combat, the really odd, but I think awesome change is how instant all of the actions of this mode are. What I mean by instant is that there's not that delay between like getting the headshot and then getting the kick somewhere into the stun, or having a little bit of time where they lay on the ground before you stomp on them, or even that initial startup inertia on running. Everything in this game, I think because it uses digital inputs, is instant. So your melee attacks, instant. Your downed attacks, instant. Your runs, instant. Everything happens immediately. And I think this might be a way to compensate for the lower FPS because this is on the 3DS. It only runs at 30 frames a second. So I think what Capcom did, which is really clever, is to make the game still feel really nice and snappy. They just remove all buffering. You just do everything instantly. And I really enjoy the feel of it. And it does change the flow of the combat and of the meta, but it also gives it its own distinct feel that I really like. So that's what stands out to me the most about Mercs 3DS. And then on top of that, they bring in these sort of RPG style perk systems.
Compared to 5, the game has a perk system, so you progressively unlock perk. So most of the game is like a tutorial, and then you get to the X mission. There are 9 X missions, which are the true classic Mercenaries mode, and they are a lot more difficult than the rest of the game. But you will progressively unlock perk, and you have perk that gives you back things like reloading through inventory or being invulnerable by grabbing an item.
Are you serious?
So you can play like that. Yes.
That is insane.
Most notoriously, there's a perk that is called the old school perk, which gives you both reloading through inventory and being invulnerable by grabbing an item. So you can have that aspect. You're not forced to have it because you can choose other perks. It depends on what strengths you want your character to have.
And the thing about the RPG elements, the perk system elements of Mercs 3DS, is the way they structure it with grinding and progression-based unlocks. I'm not a huge fan of, because it ends up just being empty engagement, tedious, and meaningless, ultimately. But the concept of having selectable perks, I think, is really cool. So when you get to the end of all of this, like with a 100% save file, I think the final result is really cool, where you can choose different perks to use and they can inform how you play. I don't think they're all that well balanced, to be honest.
The only flaw of this system is that passive bonus, and to get that passive bonus, you need to grind, you need to play with that perk just to unlock the second passive of the perk, so there's some kind of RPG elements linked.
But still, the concept, if they made it more balanced and they made it immediately unlocked and removed the progression elements, I think it's a cool way to add new layers to the Mercs mode. But as it stands right now, it is a little bit messy. And a really interesting decision they made is that you can't reset save files in this game. As in, like, on the cartridge, you can't delete them. Once you unlock something on the cartridge, it's unlocked forever. I know a lot of people don't like this, and I don't know what Capcom were thinking in terms of maybe trying to prevent used game sales or something. But I think the end result is kind of cool, because I do think it should be fully unlocked anyway. I don't like these fake progression systems, especially with Mercs, which is an arcade scoring-based system. And so overall, both Kriegor and I agree on an A ranking for this game. It gets an A because of the incredible fundamentals, the strong scoring system that it carries over from 5, but it doesn't go near the SS or S rank because the perk RPG progression-based system is tedious and unbalanced and kind of messy, though fun when fully unlocked. And another issue is just the hardware limitation of this game because it's on the 3DS. Unfortunately, you can only have a limited amount of enemies on screen, which is somewhat helped by the fact that the maps are smaller, so the spawn points are much closer together and visceral. But still, because of the limitation of enemies on screen, you don't get that pure visceral chaos that you can sometimes get in 5, especially if you play like No Mercy mode and stuff.
There are only so much enemies on screen in 3D, typically 5 at the same time. So this makes the game also a bit less enjoyable. More enemies mean more aggression and positioning and grouping and stuff like that. These limitations makes me put it in A tier, but it's still very, very solid.
Let me tell you, if you have a 3DS, in my opinion, this is a fundamental buy. Like, if you own a 3DS, you better have Mercs 3DS to pop in there because it's one of the best titles on that handheld, and I really enjoy it and love it. And it's impressive Capcom were able to make it work so well in the way that they did. And so now we get to the most controversial game on this list, Resident Evil 6. So, 6. There's so much to say about this game. There's so many angles you can come at it, and I do believe Resident Evil 6 is kind of like the buffet of action games where depending on what dinner you're coming for, you may love the game, you may hate the game, and have completely valid reasons for both loving and hating it because of how immense it is. Why try to decide what to do when we can just do everything? Let's put Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 4 right inside 6, and then let's make just this giant beast. And so what ends up happening is I'm not a huge fan of Resident Evil 6's campaign. I think the criticisms of that are completely justified because of all of the QTEs, walking sections, and just kind of crappy, uneven level design because it's so freaking huge. I do actually like how 6 breaks up the campaign into different mini campaigns. I think that's a really smart decision more games should do. But, you know, the actual quality of the campaign is contentious to say the least. But then we go into the Mercs mode, and I think Capcom did something very interesting and ambitious with Resident Evil 6's Mercs mode. So even though I don't think it overall is as good as 5's, I do have a very soft spot for it because you can't just do 5 again. It's so good. You know, I do get the idea, okay, we got to shake it up a little bit. And so 6 ends up being a huge departure, but an ambitious one. And to begin with, just in terms of its mechanical design, its combat design, the best way to describe the difference is I believe Resident Evil 5 is truly a 3D beat-em-up, very much in line with something like Spike Out or God Hand because of how closely integrated the gun combat is with the melee combat. You have guns, but they feed directly into the melee in this beautiful way. Resident Evil 6 is a character action game. I believe when we discuss character action games, it should be included in that conversation, legitimately. It should be alongside Bayonetta and Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry, because that is what it is. It is character action, perhaps to a fault, but it is impressive, the amount of things you can do in this game. So first of all, the big, huge shift is you can now move while shooting, you can move while reloading. You don't have that positional commitment to shooting anymore. And mixing with that, you do not have contextual-based attacks. Now you can manually begin your attacks. Yes, no longer do you need to create the context-sensitive kick. You can now do it manually, just like a regular action game. Except not exactly, because you still have contextual-based attacks depending on conditional stuns. And if that sounds complicated and hard to follow, that's because it is. Kriegor?
Now you can light stun or heavy stun enemies. You don't have the leg stun now. There are 3 types of stuns: light stun, head stun, and heavy stun. It's very interesting when you start understanding how you can put an enemy to light stun and how you can put an enemy to heavy stun. But basically, to put an enemy to heavy stun, you need to repeat an action that would have put it into light stun. Now that it is in light stun, it's hard to explain, but everything is hard to explain in Resident Evil 6. And when it's in this heavy stun status, so it will say immobile for a pretty long time, and you can perform a coup de grâce on it. So this rewards more time, but it takes also more time to set up an enemy for a coup de grâce.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the counter. The counter, if it kills, gives plus 10 seconds.
Whoa!
And the counter are pretty powerful. So when you play Mercenaries mode in Resident Evil 6, you have only one goal. It's no longer to kill every enemy with a melee moves, it's to kill every enemy with a counter attack. If you don't do that, you're doing it wrong.
And so, yeah, welcome to Resident Evil 6. Like I said, this is a full-on character action game at this point. It is quite intricate and complex and interesting. But the thing about Resident Evil 6 that is unfortunate is that it has what I like to call the character action difficulty curve, the inverted difficulty curve, which means that when you first play Resident Evil 6 versus playing Resident Evil 5, is that Resident Evil 6 at first seems so much more difficult. And that's because it has so many mechanics, so many intricate states, so many things you can do, so many different things the enemy does. It just seems overwhelming and insane. Whereas Resident Evil 5, the basic game plan is very clear. You know exactly what you're doing. It's building off of 4. It's like, okay, I know how to get going here. But what ends up happening is that once you learn Resident Evil 6's mechanics and understand them, and you understand how to sort through what's good and not good, you run into the problem of it actually being super overpowered on the player side. So it turns out once you know how to abuse the mechanics of Resident Evil 6, it drastically reduces the difficulty of the gameplay. And so that's what I mean by the inverted difficulty curve. Once you know the mechanics and you know how to abuse them, then you start to lose what you perceived as depth before. An example of a mechanic that plays into the inverse difficulty curve is the weapon swapping, where at first it seems like a nice feature to make your offense more flexible. But once you get the hang of doing it, you find out that you can use it to near instantly kill enemies or bosses just by swapping through heavy-hitting weapons. It frees up the mechanics on the surface, but in the end, it damages the overall depth of the combat design. Another massive example of this is the game's counter system and how OP the counter system is. It's still pretty cool, but unfortunately, it's a little overpowered. And so for Resident Evil 4 Remake fans out there, you guys think, oh yeah, the Resident Evil 4 Remake, it's parry. Oh, how innovative. Well, Resident Evil 6 has a parry, essentially, called the counter, but it's more contextual and doesn't have knife durability and doesn't look as ridiculous, honestly. The animations for the counter are really awesome, and they're very satisfying to hit. And when you first start playing the game, the counter seems like properly skill intensive because of how narrow the timing on these counters are. So at first you're like, oh damn, this is some real proper balancing with the counter system, except it can be kind of abused because you can do counter buffering. And how counter buffering works is you draw your gun and you aim it at the enemy that you want to counter, and then you wait until they're about to do the attack, and then when they do, you drop your aim, holstering your weapon, and during the holstering animation, you buffer the counter since it's not going to come out during the holstering animation, so that you can use to massively widen the counter window. And if it's not just a problem in terms of survival, this counter system is a big problem in terms of scoring because it gives you a massive time bonus for hitting counters, which completely overrides the more developed melee system's time bonuses. It kind of ends up being a funny foreshadow to Remake 4's Mercenaries mode, which is all about farming parries. But the saving grace of Resident Evil 6's counter system, at least that controls the damage somewhat, it's more contextual, and you have to set up the counter through positioning and enemy damage in a lot of cases. And so even if you are farming counters, you have to do the right amount of damage. You have to get them in the right situation. So it does still retain a lot more of the elements of the core positioning combat than Remake 4. But it's definitely a step down in terms of the depth compared to Mercenaries 5.
The Mercenaries mode, getting world record obviously is very, very hard because everything is optimized to perfection. But getting a very good score, like a perfect 150 combo and a decent time remaining at the end, is something you can get in a few hours if you have something to explain you how you should play the game. So the problem is it gives too much freedom to the player. It failed to balance the options they thought would be very hard to master. So obviously they thought countering would be very hard to master,
but it's not,
because for some reason counter and parries are like the ultimate cheat, but it's not. You're able to counter everything that comes at you.
And also there's a big issue with the way it handles boss spawns, where it allows multiple bosses to be spawned at once, which seems like it could be a good idea, except when you go back to the core gameplay of Resident Evil 6, where you're much too mobile and fast for the enemies and bosses, and the maps in 6 Mercs are massive. And so what ends up happening, unfortunately, is that even though it is a pain in the ass to have multiple bosses on screen and have a few enemies around to chain, you need to keep those bosses alive in order to cash them out at the end of your chain, since they are higher value at the end. And so what you're forced to do is to just pick off the remaining smaller enemies as they spawn. But in order to keep your chain going and alive, you need to just constantly run back and forth to all the enemy spawn points and pick them off as they come on screen to keep your chain alive. And it ends up being really tedious and boring and not nearly as engaging as the way 5 does it by limiting the bosses spawning in together. And so evaluating Mercs 6 is kind of a complicated one and sort of reminds me of Mercs 4 in a lot of ways, where the core foundation of the mechanics and the enemy design and the flow and feel of the game, if you don't really know exactly what you're doing, is actually incredibly engaging and fun. And I still have a great time playing Mercs 6. And it's something I always recommend as a massive strength of the game, especially because it's unlocked right from the beginning, so you don't even have to worry about campaign mode. You can just go right into Mercenaries mode and stay nice and safe inside there. And once you're inside there, I mean, it's just got so much content and great feeling gameplay and cool characters. And all these crazy modes like Onslaught mode, which is a Tetris-style PvP where you create chains and then based off your chains, you send in enemy bosses to the other player on the other screen. It's such a cool idea and probably the best Mercs PvP mode in the series. And so because of the sheer amount of quality content, of great mechanics, of ambition, I am giving this an A rating, but I recognize I'm being extremely generous in this ranking, and I do think Kriegor's rank, B rank, is probably the most accurate.
And every night, I spending with a group of about 30 French people who were into scoring Resident Evil. It was on Xbox 360, so we used the Xbox 360 chat, and we spent the entire night after entire night on that Xbox live chat. And every night there was someone to say, "Hey, did you know you can like tight turn with the power button, or did you know that you can put the grass mutation doing this?" And every time we were like, "What? You can do that?" Discovering the game was so fun. For all of these reasons, I would put it in B tier, so above Resi 4, but still below the Mercenaries 3D.
But again, one thing that I really want to emphasize about Mercenaries 6 is that if you're a huge fan of Mercenaries 6, you could go in there and modify it and shift a lot of these issues with the scoring system, you know, make counters less OP, give them less time bonuses, fix the issues with the grenade, fix the issues with the spawn rates, maybe up the enemy aggression, up the overall difficulty, make the player less OP generally. There's just a lot of little subtle shifts and changes that could be applied to Resi 6. As it stands right now, it's kind of a mess, but a really fun, engaging mess, like most character action games, if we're being fair. So yeah, it's definitely better than like Bayo 3 and a lot of other character action games. So I still have a real huge soft spot for it, and I think it's worth checking out, absolutely. And then we have Resident Evil Village Mercenaries mode, which I haven't even bothered to play. So we're going to turn to our Mercenaries mode expert Kriegor for this one.
Everyone has forgotten about Resident Evil Village Mercenaries mode. It sucks so much.
Yeah, go ahead.
I dislike pretty much everything about this. I've tried really hard to find one good aspect, but I'm sorry, I won't be able to give you a quality. First, the gameplay. I really don't like this FPS gameplay where you can move so independently to where you're firing at. And I don't like that there's almost no layer on top of this basic FPS gameplay. It's the only one on our list with such a conventional gameplay. Village just feels like it was made by Electronic Arts or Activision. Many people say 5 and 6 don't deserve to be Resident Evil, and I'm like that with 7 and 8. Just feels like such a different series. It's a bit more like in the red mode of the Revelation, so it's not full-on RPG because every new game have you starting fresh, so that at least is a good thing. But enemies tend to be damage sponges, and you have a clear damage of a clear indication of how much damage you're dealing RPG style, just like in red mode with numbers popping out. And also they pretty much stand in their spawning location. It's up to you to bring the fight to them. So it's almost about knowing their
They're not even chasing you.
So you have to really know where they spawn, otherwise you won't be able to keep your combos. So the time you have to keep a combo is 15 seconds, just like in 6, but in this one it's fully justified by the distance you have to cover and their HP.
Right.
The gameplay is basically just run, shoot, from spawn location to spawn location. Completely throws what for established the dynamic of stunning your enemies and using him for iframes and all the interesting beat 'em up mechanic that you have in 4, 5 and even 6. You don't have that in 8 as well. It's just move around and shoot or spam your melees until the enemies dead.
So what would you rank Resident Evil Village? And I have a guess.
I think I will put it in H tier.
Yes.
Each tier is too high.
And so here we go, Resident Evil 4 Remake Mercenaries mode. It wasn't even available with the game at launch, and so when I reviewed Remake 4, I couldn't even talk about it because it wasn't there. So over a year or so later, here we are, Resident Evil 4 Remake Mercenaries. First of all, I will give it credit for making the decision to make the headshot stun consistent, which it isn't in professional in the campaign mode. Luckily, Capcom realized, yeah, that's probably a idea for a scoring game and just maybe the idea overall. And so at least it does avoid that statistical RNG issue that it has in the campaign. So I'll give it credit for that. And I'll also give it credit for remembering to do time remaining for the runs, which the original Resident Evil 4 doesn't have. Granted, we've been on a long journey since then, so it's kind of obvious that they should add that in at this point, but they did, so you got to give it credit for that. That being said, the way they do the time bonuses of this version of Mercs overall shows its deeper problems, because when you go from playing all the other versions of Mercenaries and then play Resident Evil 4 Remake, you're reminded, unfortunately, of all the sludgy changes to the combat system where you have this really obnoxious movement inertia. Gone is the precise spacing, and then you have this really imprecise, weird feeling gun sway when you draw the gun. So there goes the whole beat 'em up dynamic of really tight, precise kicks into shots. That's all gone. And then you add on top of that this chaotic, aggressive enemy design where they just constantly chase after you. And what you end up having is a dynamic where the enemies are much more mobile and able to deal with you in close range than you are, especially when you get them grouped up together. You're no longer rewarded for grouping enemies in terms of melee. And so it all comes down to just the shooting dynamics of this game, especially with the level design. What you do, this is the winning strategy, S++ rank, clear your first few times. You post up in the corner and you just headshot, reload, change weapon, headshot, reload, change weapon. It's all about managing weapon swaps and reloading and managing your mayhem meter. And the whole beat 'em up dynamic of moving around, chaining, all that sort of stuff is really diminished, especially since you have this massive chain timer of 15 seconds, and you're able to wipe people out almost instantly with headshots. And so, unfortunately, what it ends up being in terms of the gameplay overall is you just find yourself a corner and you shoot, shoot, shoot. And then if you have characters who can do melee attacks safely, like Wesker, notice how it is implemented into the game. Rather than doing the natural movement and frame data and hitboxes like the other Mercs, instead, Wesker just has this magic iframe teleport. So it doesn't have the same real spacing. It's like hard-coded in the game to work, because otherwise it naturally doesn't. Just look at how Leon's melee combat holds up. And what this ends up meaning is that none of your legacy skills from the other Mercenaries games doesn't apply and can be actively bad, because if you do try to do the more beat 'em up style, you're going to get heavily punished for it. It's just such a massive step down from the rest of the series, and you can tell it's a real break in continuity. You can tell this is a new team aiming at a new audience, and basically it's baby's first Mercenaries mode. It's insanely easy and very shallow and basic. They essentially wanted to make the Mercenaries mode just kind of a little bit of extra bonus content and make sure you can achieve like a perfect chain and a perfect run in like 3 tries, especially because it would be so easy to build off the flaws of the original 4's Mercenaries mode. And instead, it's just totally shifted in this basic direction. So first of all, what does any modern game mode need? Meter. Of course it has meter. Why wouldn't it? Every modern version of something has to have meter. Look at Tekken 8's heat system. And yes, I am aware that Resident Evil 6 has stamina meter, but there is a distinctive and important difference between something like a stamina meter, which is more discrete, contextual, and limited, though I'm not a huge fan of that. I prefer 5 meterless. But the effect of the stamina meter is more isolated, whereas with this mayhem meter, it's a macro meter. It changes the entire meta of how the game is played. Everything revolves around mayhem. When you're not in mayhem, you're building meter to get mayhem, and then when you're in mayhem, you're just insta-killing things in a fashion that is completely disconnected from the core design of the combat system. And this is the type of meter that I think is really a big problem in modern game design. Look at what it's doing to Tekken, where the meter mechanics just override the fundamental natural mechanics of the game so completely that the entire meta just revolves around the meter. This was a huge mistake, and whatever potential that Remake for Mercs had is intensely damaged by this decision that I'm sure they weren't thinking too much about. And the way it works is that you run around the map and you farm parries and use the parries to activate mayhem, which is just insta-kill from Call of Duty zombies, by the way. So this isn't even an original idea. It's just take insta-kill and put a meter on it. And that is the meta of playing Leon. Run around, farm parries, mayhem, rinse and repeat. And ironically, Resident Evil 4 Remake repeats the same issue that the original Resident Evil 4 has with completely nullifying the melee system. So the reason why the melee system in the original 4 isn't a factor, like I explained earlier, is because there's no time bonus kill on melees. In this, it's not that there isn't time bonus kill on melee, it's just that shooting in this game fundamentally is just far superior, because you can move while aiming, you can reload while moving, and you have a full-on third-person aiming camera. This mode plays a lot more like Call of Duty Zombies than Resident Evil Mercenaries. And if that's not enough, the chain timer is 15 seconds, which is lenient to the point of absurdity. You have to actively try to drop your chain at this point, especially because of how quickly you can kill enemies by just aiming and shooting them in the head or getting mayhem insta-kills. So chaining is no longer a factor.
One word about the time the game allows you to keep your combo. 15 seconds. It's way too long. At least in 6, you had to run long distance from spawn to spawn to set up enemy for melees. In 8, we've talked about it, enemies are long to kill and you also have to reach them. But in 4 Remake, where every enemy is at your throat at all time and you kill so quickly and you don't even need to melee kill for bonus points, it should have been 10 seconds max, not even 10 seconds. So there's absolutely no challenge to get that 150 combo.
You don't have that tension of competing incentives nearly as much anymore. You do a bit with the Hunk character, but with the other characters, their game plan is absolutely mapped out and you just follow it to the T. That is that. Also, I want to point out that the level design of the Mercs map is so poor that there are literal safe spots in 3 of the maps where you can put your back up against the wall. It wasn't until the final DLC map that they finally realized, wait a second, safe spots are probably not a good idea. It's just not interesting. It's not well thought out. It's clearly an afterthought because it wasn't even there at launch. It doesn't have nearly the amount of content and scope as 5 and 6. I think it's just whatever, and the developers clearly feel the same way. So both Kriegor and I agree on the ranking of D for Resident Evil 4 Remake Mercenaries.
I don't think it will stand the test of time as well as 4, but I will put it in D tier as well. I will put it just below Resident Evil 4 tier.
So in the end, I do think the Mercenaries mode of Remake 4 is a lot more fun and engaging than the campaign of Remake 4 because they clearly did have to think about the combat system of the game at least a little bit more and try to balance it and kind of make it interesting. But ironically, in that attempt, it also shows just how unlike Remake 4 is to the original game and to the rest of the series, and how it's more of just a generic third-person shooter in the end, which isn't the worst thing or anything, but it's definitely a massive step down compared to the rest of the series, other than Village, which is just pure. And so, yes, thank you for tuning in to Kriegor and I's tier list for the mercenary modes across the Resident Evil games. They are my favorite aspect of the Resident Evil series. I think it is a cool way that Capcom were able to maintain their arcade roots while also putting it in a setting that a lot of more mainstream survival horror type of players may enjoy, or action game players may enjoy. And it's crazy the amount of range the mercenary modes have, from fixed camera 3 to just the delightful, delicious beat 'em up shooter fusion that is 4 and 5, to a sort of character action style of 6. And the depth of the scoring, the quality, it is Capcom at its finest. And I definitely recommend playing through the Mercenaries games, and do not just view them as this bonus-only content like IGN. They are games unto themselves, especially 5, 6, and 3DS, and I highly recommend playing them, checking them out. They are insanely replayable, so much fun. And if you enjoyed this tier list, I definitely recommend checking out both my review of Resident Evil 4 Remake, as well as my review of Resident Evil 5. A lot of what I discuss in the Mercenaries modes of this tier list, I also feel applies to the campaigns of those games. And I think the Mercenaries players are an underrepresented demographic of the Resident Evil fan base. Clearly, the Remake developers don't care about us. And I'm afraid that probably the Mercs modes are starting to be a thing of the past because they're too arcade-oriented, they're too replayable, they're too good. I don't know. But I'm a huge fan of them, and I definitely recommend checking them out if you are just strictly playing the mainline campaigns. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'm a full-time YouTuber, so Patreon is how I pay my rent and eat my bread, and there's a lot of cool exclusive content on the Patreon that I think is cool to also check out if you subscribe. So thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Ally, Autonamed, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Beto Dames, Blade Symphony, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Red Cox, Rosif Swagman, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Shapelip, Chronic Burnout 3, Christopher R, Flair Cliff, Flay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Concrete, Cooksan666, Cooks and Soup, Corio, CSP 309,000, Des Audio, DRK, Dan Matei, Dances with Incels, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, Dave Hansen, David Aldress, David Crespo, Didaidan, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Aquinta, Edvard, Elvin Senisev, Eleanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lazama, Explosive General Games, Fabio Pichi, Falcus, Fenich, Fiskin, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Retro Schmupper, Gods W Bomb, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hausu, Hewdet, On Harthy, HUD, Humongous, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jimmy Striggins, Jing Hans, JMV, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, Josaka, Gameboy Guru, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Ken10082, Kill All Music, Kiss Kissian, Contain, Praise the Boys, Langoblian, Ludwa, Loberta, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Luna Lalich, LZR Cuter, Mad Kabaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Minung, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, Mew Jam, Michael Polito, Michael McCord, Milady, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitward, Mitwid, Rogue, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Eco Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Ogre Mode, Okla Kugels, Oleg, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Peace, Pedro Perez, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Kulan Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Random, Raul, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Renholtz Time, Retrojet, Retro Man, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Wolf015, Salmon Connections, Sam, Sanivo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Seesaw FW, Segfall, Shader Bunny, Chantak, Jazzy, Shifted, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Sirapong, Social Kid, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Tamzarian, Tazrayu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Thom McCarthy, Tim French, TK Productions, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Tsugumo, Taram, 2YU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Unicorn Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Rena, Vulgarity, Wabby Legs, What Is This? Your Nerdy Joe, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zenryoku.